for listening to the e-flux podcast.
It's a real pleasure to have Vivian Ziherl in e-flux offices to on really the night, the eve, the afternoon of the opening of her kind of exhibition happening downstairs called Toxic Assets, which we'll begin tonight and we'll continue through this October weekend at e-flux. Vivian, great to have you here.
Thanks, Brian. And I'm definitely going to have to borrow the notion of the exposium. That will be my next e-flux essay.
So I want to talk about a few things with you today in a very short time, where I think we have some 25 minutes or so, and I should start the clock. I want to talk about your kind of curatorial platform, Frontier Imaginaries. And I want to ask you also some things about the frontier as both a kind of a personal and a political space. And I think we can probably we should hear about this really kind of really brilliant concept that you speak about often called the Fourfold. But to begin, I guess maybe our listeners out there in the world would like to hear or should know about Frontier Imaginaries, your curatorial platform.
Right. Well, Frontier Imaginaries has been around since 2015. And last year, it began with a really big exhibition festival in Brisbane, in Australia, across 3 platforms. And then later in the year, it morphed into the guise of the Jerusalem show that was part of the 3rd Calandier International. And then here tonight, as you've said, it will once again rear its mutant head within the downtown offices and exhibition space of e-flux. And so you can see a kind of a trajectory there in terms of what the things that might connect Brisbane town on the Pacific Rim, Jerusalem, occupied city within the Mediterranean, edge of the Middle East, and New York City, formerly, of course, New Amsterdam. And the Netherlands is where this is all headed early next year as well. So the frontier is the center point of the work, which is really a kind of ongoing research jam among artists and curators and architects and activists and all kinds of ungainly and beautiful folk, and who gather and continue to unfold a set of ideas around what the ongoing significance of this concept of the frontier might be within the global era. So the frontier is often imagined as a term that's proper to the 18th or 19th centuries, where it can be imagined as a kind of an actual territorial boundary that's expanding across the Mercator projection across the world. So, of course, in the United States context, you think of the Western Front expanding west. So the provocation of Frontier Imaginaries is that within the global era, so when this line hypothetically has vanished and it's a fully satellite encoded surface of the planet, how does that line, or how does the force of the frontier continue to territorialize, continue to organize bodies, continue to organize worlds? What are its material and, let's say, molecular effects, and what are the tactics that are being played out in order to maintain the worlds that it's attempting to enclose?
And you also have a background,
right?
which is very close to the frontier, spiritually and politically. No,
right. That's absolutely true. I mean, it's no mistake that the project emerged from this place called Brisbane, which kind of marks like a thumbtack the northernmost limit of urbanized area in the southeast of Australia. Not so long ago, Brisbane hosted the G20 Leaders Summit, and the whole city was festooned with hoardings that declared Brisbane to be a global city. And in many ways, the first edition of Frontier Imaginaries was a kind of a confrontation or a provocation to that, to argue that Brisbane continues to be a frontier town, which means that it's a place that's completely organized by the very heavy relations of an urban-rural divide, of a metropolitan or urbanized place that's heavily organized by its relation to a vast mineral-rich area to the north of it. And the frontier also is heavily implied in the organization of gender as well, which I would say heavily informed my emerging angry female subjectivity as well, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, what is really what I love so much about your work and the way that you speak about it is the way that you are able to also mobilize this logic of the frontier in all of its most kind of horrific, kind of forms of extraction and fracking and but as a productive engine also. Also as a source. So I mean, as a source of knowledge about colonialism and how colonialism basically enables and disables so many of the things that we are doing simultaneously. I think even on the level of having a kind of symposium or exposium there is also a certain play of the frontier.
Right. I mean, that was something that particularly came to the fore when we had the amazing opportunity to do the Jerusalem show with Al Mamel Foundation and in the context of the Columbia International. In terms of, there's an operative idea within the project of what I call the settler region. And so this is the proposal that there is a coherent global region in the world that is the settler region, which includes Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Israel, to a certain extent to this day, South Africa. And it's a region that's completely coherent. The leaders have access to each other. The heads of the mining corporations have access, and the security corporations have access to each other. But simply let's say the dissenting populations are geographically far dispersed and therefore have not such excellent access to each other. And to a certain extent, Frontier Imaginaries is an intervention that leverages the inherent mobility of contemporary art, the inherent, cosmopolitanism and travel budgets and air tickets and passport opportunities of the contemporary art world in order to stage those encounters physically. And something that we had that was very beautiful with Al Mamel was a number of each of the 5 exhibition spaces had a wall that was painted with the word return in all of the languages of all of the artists that were contributing. So there was return within Burmese or Shan in particular. There was return in numerous African languages that are within the nation state of South Africa. There was return in indigenous languages as well. And there was a real way in which that concept was coherent within all of those places, although the different way that it was, let's say, it mechanically worked helped to shed light on a relation that is same but different.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And then as you move the project temporarily to New York, I think it's not a coincidence that you chose the term toxic assets for New York, which suggests all of the kind of the dirtier side of the extractive side of predatory finance and the practices that we have associated with New York's financial industry in the past decade or so.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would date it back even to sort of the late 70s and early 80s as well. I mean, that's certainly the twist that we begin to put pressure on here. Something that was extremely interesting that emerged from the edition in Palestine and in Jerusalem was the deployment of Elizabeth A. Povinelli's Symphony of Late Liberalism. So this, in its first instance, we installed as a wallpaper in Brisbane, and at that point it had a symphony, let's say a music manuscript line charting global events, and then a manuscript line charting events that were felt, particularly from the perspective of Indigenous people in the north of Australia. In Jerusalem, we added an extra stanza for events and experiences that had been felt within Palestine in particular. This required a number of adjustments onto the global level as well, and in particular a lot of events around the formation and negotiation of decolonizing states that hadn't been present when it had been inscribed from the Indigenous Australian perspective. And something that was enormously striking there was the very vivid way in which it was possible to chart a transition within the international economic order from a focus upon, let's say, extra state organizations such as the UN, which had, of course, been where petitions for sovereignty had been made, through something that was to have been the NIEO, the New International Economic Order. And that was to be a complete overhaul of the international economic system through UNCTAD, the United Nations Convention on Trade and Development. So it had been achieved through the UN by a number of newly decolonizing states. However, it's mandated at almost exactly the moment that the Bretton Woods institutions come to the fore internationally. So that's the IMF and the World Bank. And at around, or shortly before the time when the resolution of the petrodollar crisis, which was, of course, resolved by funneling a huge glut in money through the Manhattan bank system and depositing that money into southern states as those who were thought to be like safe lenders or borrowers. And of course, it's upon the default of Mexico in '82 that the World Bank and the IMF sort of restructure the international order. So there's a sort of a 70s, 80s twist that is really operated through the Netherlands that sort of marks a shift in terms of a financialized mode of governance within the broader ongoing liberal governance of the globe under the institutions of the market nation state, which I sort of characterize as Borromean rings. So it's sort of the way in which New York is a footprint that's been felt, in the top end of Australia, you know, but also the way that those tactics fall back on New York eventually as well. So that's, you know, in a potted history why we talk about toxic assets, although of course that term specifically was coined in around 2006 with the subprime crisis here.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that contemporary art, but then also these kind of global flows and movements mobilize these different cities and different places in the world as spaces of passage, as basically kind of, you know, gigantic airports where things just sort of move through in a network. But then it seems that for you affirm that by sneakily kind of sliding in that this movement creates severe damage and scars, and these are actually kind of enormous repositories of violence.
Right. I mean, of course, a lot of what the project is charting is, and what the Frontier in fact charts 101 is the latest rollout of technologies of dispossession. That's always what it is, and that's why it sort of immediately leads back to a conversation around what has been theorized as primitive accumulation, but that is being re-theorized along a number of axes at present as well.
So before we get further, go further down that road, I wonder if you could also just tell us a little bit, tell our listeners a bit about the program and what we have planned for the next 3 days, including tonight.
Yeah. So the program, in fact, already has commenced up at Columbia 2 days ago at the university there with a great screening program, and then again last night with a screening program at Union Docks, both of which were completely booked out and very lively programs. So I'm assuming that there's a certain energy that's going to keep rolling on. That's really exciting. So the 3 days come under 3 kind of titles. There's toxic languages, toxic properties, and toxic sovereignty. And tonight's Toxic Languages is kind of, you know, an evening event. You turn up, get a drink, sit down, enjoy the show. There'll be dance, there'll be poetry. But it operates upon, or it pivots upon an idea of languages of value, so how value is inscribed within languages, including, you know, like the contract is a legal poetry by which to secure the order of a certain regime of value, right? So languages of value, value of language, you know, we'll even be moving into like dance as a movement language by which, you know, particularly communities in New York have innovated in order to survive the kind of urban restructuring that took place here 70s, 80s as well. And Tara Critchlow will be presenting on the legacy of Marjorie Smart, a Haitian New York dancer who was a leader in that community, recently passed away. Tomorrow we'll be talking about, for a big kind of one-day juggernaut seminar on toxic properties. That's kind of real back-to-back sort of very exciting, but very strong, deep, tough kind of thinking.
Demanding.
Yes, exactly. Kind of strap yourself in for sort of 8 back-to-back papers. Delving really into the idea of the property form, and so tracing it from, like the innovation of new property forms on the frontier in Australia historically, when settlers were seeking to find a way to purchase land sight unseen that required a whole lot of legal unravelings that weren't possible to actually undertake in the States, and that now appear as the preferred legislation in the IMF. That's the research of Rachel O'Reilly. To, for example, a paper I'm really excited about from Greg Tate, who's presenting on the notion of hip-hop and cultural property, and who'll be digging into the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and the notion of the sorrowful song as some kind of a sonic resistance, all the way to someone like Nefertiti X.M. Tadiar, who'll be presenting from a Philippine perspective on the global political economy of the derivative and the notion of a human derivative and sort of life that is worth expending, more valuable spent than cared or maintained. Yeah. Sorry. Then there's a Sunday.
Yeah, of course.
Which is on this topic of toxic sovereignty. So that's where it really, it really comes to a head in terms of sovereignty being often and it's a sensitive calculus, that one, because sovereignty is the claim that emerges from Indigenous communities in Australia, in the States, in Canada. So one is very tentative about any conversation that may weaken the pragmatic claim that is made as Indigenous sovereignty. Nonetheless, sovereignty, when it is awarded, as we've seen through the decolonial process historically, is awarded as the liberal nation-state form, which tends to undercut the actual claims that Indigenous people are making. So we'll be examining this kind of double bind within what it means to have a critique of liberalism at the present time, which speaks to much broader crises in the existing liberal institutions of market nation state.
Right. And you have said, and you have written in the description of the event that the problem with critiquing liberalism is that the fascists have one too.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the dot point manifesto of the neo-reactionaries on Reddit, it's breathtaking. I mean, like 50% of it could be one-to-one from a Foucault text, and then 50% of it is like pure white nationalism. It's true to Frontier Imaginaries as a project pragmatically in the world, that we're also constantly playing the double bind of the art institution as a place that proposes itself to be a site of freedom, of total possibility, and so leveraging that largesse in order to stage conversations that are in fact, at base, extremely critical of these institutions. So there's a kind of always a double play that's going on.
So would you say that in a sense that the liberal state, which is supposed to, which is expected in demands for sovereignty or even for new sovereignties and for exits from states, as we can see with Catalonia and the UK and Scotland. So it just, the list goes on. It becomes more and more of a pattern that we see today. But then as a kind of a horizon for indigenous peoples, right? For people who have been on the losing side of colonial wars and colonial history, then would you say that also that the liberal state or these notions of sovereignty that accompanied the era of colonialism is actually not the place to be looking?
Yep, precisely. And I think that's the set of conversations that we have with Frontier Imaginaries, and it's also one of the reasons why we have it through art and aesthetics as well, because of course these conversations are working at the limits of the sets of ideas that are possible within what Denise de Silva calls the modern text, in terms of what the categories are. It's constantly failing, and it's one of the reasons why filmmaking or image making is so useful for us. I mean, historically, one of the things that's important and that I've mentioned already in terms of Beth Povinelli's Symphony of Liberalisms is that the era of land rights within Australia was ushered in fact, through a wages dispute. So it was in the early 70s when on a property, a cattle property in the centre of the country, there was a number of families that went on a walk-off. So again, there's an irony. They apparently walked off land that was their own land in order to make a protest against the fact that they were not being paid wages as wards of the state. The wages that they would have been awarded was only half what a white citizen would have been earning anyway. But it was then when they took the protest camp to a sacred site that it flipped and it became a wages dispute, but not for wages, but for something completely else. And that ushered in the land rights era effectively and the first Land Rights Act, 1976, which scripted some kind of recognition for territorial integrity that wasn't, that could exist under law, but then wasn't the recognition of a state, but was something else. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of continued through the 70s and 80s and 90s, but was progressively watered down and rolled back. And the thing that marks the end of that era is the quote-unquote intervention, which was the deployment of 600 Australian Defence Force troops upon remote Indigenous communities in order to secure market normativity of the worlds of the people living there. And it's that moment that ushered in the beginning of the Katabing Film Collective's filmmaking as well.
Who are, of course, a kind of special guest of this entire cycle of the symposium.
Exactly. I mean, the e-flux will be hosting the largest travelling group of the Katabing Film Collective to date, whose cinema making is extraordinary and so generous in terms of what it offers international audiences, not in terms of access to some kind of ancient, what Richard Bell would call ooga booga knowledge, but in terms of what it permits international audiences to access in terms of what is in fact impossible within the lives that people in cities live and create.
So, by way of conclusion, I wonder if you could just speak quite briefly for just a couple of minutes about this brilliant concept of yours, the fourfold, if possible.
Right. I mean, my doctoral supervisors at the moment are in a very busy business of getting me to expand upon it, but I will try to give you the potted version at the moment. The fourfold has been one of the main things that has been learnt through Frontier Imaginaries over the past couple of years. And as I mentioned before, the notion of the frontier points towards a kind of an aspirational limit of modernity or the modern text. So the frontier is sort of the horizon of pure possibility towards which modernity projects itself as an improving force of history. So with the capital S spirit of Hegel. And so the frontier sort of marks everything beyond which is outside, which is entirely unknowable, and so therefore, again, there's sort of this condition of like maximum risk as well. So in many ways, the frontier is, it can be imagined as a territorial limit. It's a distance notion, but that notion is a distance that can be organized also, for example, culturally. So the frontier is the limit at which a contract cannot be formed one way or another. And so that leads very quickly within the world of, Western and Anglo-critical theory to an examination of what is called primitive accumulation. And that's the moment within Marx's texts that he's trying to explain the emergence of capital itself as a system. So he's talking about the moment at which the relations of capital come into being in his narration through the vast dispossessions of the enclosures movement, which produces, mobile labor that can be exploited. So he's talking about a moment of expropriation that's prior to the ongoing condition of exploitation, which is the system of capital. there's three very, very useful recent critical texts that have emerged, well, or three axes of critical work that's been emerging recently that's sort of been going back over this notion of primitive accumulation and pointing to a number of, let's say, critical shortcomings within its reading. So one would be Sylvie Frederici, for example, who within her essay Caliban and the Witch analyzes the necessity of producing unpaid, unvalued female labor in order to produce that labor force, and in order, like the dispossession of the feminine itself, right? And then there would be a number of excellent critics and scholars working on blackness who have pointed to the failure to account for within the costs of cotton, upon which, of course, Marxist texts are heavily based, to account for the actual cost of enslaved labor within the production of cotton. So there's a hidden category of the racial, again, that which appears as of no value and, in fact, of no human presence. Then there's, so that would be, for example, Fred Moten's done excellent work on that, and Denise De Silva's done excellent work on that, among many others. You'd then have a scholar such as Glenn Sean Coulthard, a Yellow Knives Dine scholar, who refutes the primitiveness of primitive accumulation and argues that, in fact, it's the accumulation of the prior, it's the accumulation of the original that is continuing to go on within Indigenous experiences, for example, in Canada. And Elizabeth A. Povinelli has also written in this regard as well in terms of what she calls the governance of the prior. So you can then kind of model the value form in terms of a series of cuts. So you'd have the horizontal cut of gender across the social body. That's the vertical cut of gender across the social body, the horizontal cut of the racial across the social body, and a kind of a temporal cut as of those that are within the time of the society of the market nation state or not. Indigenous people always somehow being prior, unless, as we saw with the efforts of the intervention, they are somehow disciplined into the time of the market society. Right. And so that
these two cuts are basically the kind of geometry of the fourfold, right?
Yeah, so three. So there's vertical, horizontal, and temporal. And I argue that kind of creates a geometry of the social body of man, and it arbitrates what is within the developing value society of the market nation state, and that which is without, which is waste, which is outside, available to be accumulated upon. And it rolls out heavily in terms of the classical organization of the citizen, and who is, I mean, it was Kojin Karatani that sort of says, like, no slaves, no women, no foreigners. That was Greek democracy.
There's so much to talk about, but in the interest of time, I think we should probably wrap it up, and for listeners who want to read more and understand better, I think Vivian Ziherl has many texts published and should probably be writing a book on the Fourfold. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Vivian, for being here.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the weekend.